So, what is socialism? There are a lot of competing definitions from both opponents and proponents, but I would distill it down to these four candidates, these possible definitions, in order of those I most prefer to least prefer. Number one, the definition I most prefer is that socialism is a vision of a classless society, in particular, a society that has no ruling elite. Secondly, I would define socialism as a democratic economy, and this encompasses the usual dictionary definition you sometimes might get, like say from Wikipedia, wherein socialism is a society where the workers control the means of production. That's a kind of democratic economy, and there are variations within which we'll talk about. Thirdly, we could define socialism as income and wealth redistribution. This is a common way people think about socialism in the United States, and certainly it is a feature associated with socialism, though some socialists would insist that pre-distribution is preferable to redistribution. So I don't think this is the best definition, but I don't think it's entirely wrong either. And lastly, the definition I least prefer is to define socialism as collectivism. And of course, the most obvious problem with this definition is that collectivism itself is a nebulous term that we would have to define, and there are a lot of competing definitions among both proponents and opponents of how to define collectivism, as we'll get into. So those, I would say, are the four possible definitions. Maybe I'm missing a few, and there's a bit of overlap between these definitions, admittedly. But anyway, let's go into them in depth. So firstly, classless society. Again, it's a society with no ruling elite. And what socialists will tell us is that you can't have a society where the economic benefits and burdens are distributed unequally and still have a classless society, because then you have de facto classes, economic classes. And these class divisions are not harmless. They don't just mean that some people lead lives of luxury while others have decent but not so luxurious lives. The class division has deleterious consequences on the lives of the masses, and in fact even has some bad consequences for people in the elite. Now, in a lot of American discourse, it's often assumed that the United States is a classless society. We don't have the social classes of the old aristocratic order, and so therefore we must be a classless society. Well, socialists say, yes, we have de jure equality, we have equality in law, but capitalism creates a de facto class division by elevating a class of people, the capitalists. So it's important then to understand, how do we define capitalism? The definition I think you usually get, both from proponents of capitalism and also, say, like teachers trying to give students a dispassionate definition, the definition they give is just, well, you have private ownership of means of production, meaning things like land, factories, machinery, etc., and then you have free markets, meaning that the government mostly doesn't intervene in the operations of the economy. It's just there mainly to enforce contracts and to protect property. Now, socialists will say that prior to the era we call capitalism, we had a lot of actual private ownership of means of production, and free market exchange was far from uncommon, at least among the aristocratic class and the merchant classes. Perhaps free market activity was a much smaller part of the overall economy, and there was much less of it, but the thing that really changed, the thing that was really new in the capitalist era, is that you have the masses selling their labor. That's the real new thing. Prior to capitalism, in the feudal era, most people were serfs. They did agricultural labor, and they weren't employees of the local lord. There was just a social arrangement where the serfs worked the land and gave up some percentage, which is not really the same arrangement. In the pre-liberal era under feudalism, your lord wasn't just your boss, they were your lord and master. They were effectively your government. So in this era, there really wasn't any separation between the government and the economy. They were not conceived to be separate things. Then the liberal thinkers like John Locke come along and say, no, these things should be separate. There's the political realm of the government, but when it comes to economics, the government's just there to guarantee order and enforce contracts and protect private property. This rise of liberalism, in the classical sense, this change in political thinking, coincided with a major shift in how the masses survived, how they made a living. In the early capitalist era, we see more and more people shifting from the old feudalist model to surviving by selling their labor. The other key thing that was new under capitalism is now the people who own the means of production are profiting by employing paid labor. To be sure, the concept of profit predates the capitalist system. In the Renaissance, you had merchants and financiers who were profiting, but they weren't generally profiting by consuming paid labor, or at least that was a relatively uncommon arrangement until the capitalist era. So, if that's capitalism, what do socialists not like about it? Well, not all socialists necessarily agree with everything Karl Marx said, but almost all socialists accept his critique of capitalism. And the core thing Marx pointed out about capitalism, Contrary to Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the other classical economists, Marx said that under this system of private property, free markets, and wage labor, you have this class division between the people with capital, the capitalists, the people who are directly consuming labor, the people with means. They naturally are going to accumulate more and more wealth and power. There's a tendency within capitalism, there is this positive feedback loop whereby the people with wealth, the people with capital, there's this tendency built into the system whereby they will accumulate more and more wealth and power at the expense of everyone else, at the expense of the labor class. And this cost to the labor class is not just worsening wages, it's not just worsening their compensation, it's worsening the nature of the work they have to perform, particularly how many hours they have to work and how hard they have to work within those hours. Within the system of capitalism, Marx said, profits mainly derive from the exploitation of labor, by which he meant that employers, when they pay for labor, they're expecting to get back more than what they pay for it. And he calls this exploitation because the labor class is not getting the value that they produce. The surpluses are going to the capitalists. Now, I think a lot of Marxists actually make a mistake when they try to emphasize that in any particular employment arrangement, you, the individual worker in that transaction, are getting screwed by your employer. I think there are actually a lot of holes in that story. It's not entirely true, and also I think hard to convince people in many cases that this is actually going on in any particular employment situation, that the employees are getting screwed by their employer. But that's in the particular individual cases. But I think the real problem as identified by Marx is that capitalists as a class are exploiting labor as a class. As Marx describes, the capitalist class can really only make profits as long as they have the advantage in the labor market. They need labor to be cheap, and usually that's what they get. Outside of some rare circumstances, like, say, the post-war period in America in the late 90s, the labor market historically has almost always been a buyer's market, and if you read Marx, he goes into detail about why this is the case. The very common counter-argument against this Marxist story is, hey, look at actual history, look at what happened since Marx's time. Clearly things got better, not just for capitalists, but also really for everyone, for the masses. Well, you don't actually have to read Marx that closely to see that he was really talking about a tendency for the condition of the labor class to worsen. There are also countervailing forces. In particular, what happened in this period of, say, 1850 to 1980, in this 130-year period, two major things happened. You had all this technological development, and you had market expansion. The world of capitalism expanded from England and America to the rest of Europe, and then out to the larger world, East Asia, Latin America, etc. And what these new markets provided mainly were new resources, particularly a cheap supply of labor. So in the Marxist story, in the core capitalist countries, yeah, things generally have gotten better for the masses, but if you look at the whole capitalist world, you'll see that there's this large periphery that is being exploited. And yes, in this process, the masses of England, their condition greatly improves, but a much larger mass of people on the periphery of capitalism takes their place on the lowest rungs of the capitalist system. Now, there's a whole debate about imperialism, colonialism, and whether it's better to be exploited on the periphery of capitalism or just to be totally left out. That's a whole debate. But the key point here is that capitalism as a worldwide system has always historically had a mass of cheap labor to exploit, and Marx says that's not an accident, that's not incidental. The system relies upon having that mass to exploit, and many socialists would blame capitalism for colonialism and imperialism and creating the conditions that gives capitalism worldwide masses to exploit. The other big obvious thing that's changed since Marx's time is that there really was an unprecedented degree of technological development, starting with steam power and railways, and then motor engines, electrification, the light bulb, radio, audio recordings, penicillin, telegraphs, the telephone, airplanes, plastic, computers, photographs, movies, television, assembly line mass production, robotic assembly, space travel, satellites, radar, lasers, nuclear power, mechanized agriculture, and even more. So indisputably, there was this period of huge technological development. The question, though, is how much of this should be credited to capitalism? Now, Marx himself is actually quite generous in crediting capitalism with innovation in creating new modes of production and products. In particular, if you just define capitalism as free markets and competition, then certainly you can credit capitalism with being particularly adept at creating consumer goods like dishwashing machines and Walkmen. But I think it's also really obvious that the bulk of the credit for this technological progress goes to science, particularly physics and chemistry, which discovered certain surprising things about the physical world that we could utilize. And this created a Cambrian explosion of all these new things we could do, particularly with electricity and burning fuels. Where would we be if the physical world didn't allow such things to be possible? The nature of the physical world is, of course, something we can't control, and so we can't say with any certainty that discoveries will be made that lead to whole new avenues of technological development. Now, I'm not saying I expect technological development to come to a standstill anytime soon, but I think if you look at the trend, particularly the last 5 decades, yes, we've had some major advances, particularly computers, telecommunications, medicine, and further refinements in things like battery tech, but there's hardly anything in the last 50 years that has profoundly changed our material condition compared to how much it changed in the prior 150 years, particularly if you account for humans' hierarchy of needs. The big obvious things that have changed, like computers, the internet, and smartphones, those are certainly nice things to have, and they certainly do improve things in many ways, but they're just not improving people's material condition in the same way as, say, plumbing or electrification or heating or food production or mechanized transportation. I personally certainly like the internet and video games and all of that sort of stuff, but clearly these things just don't rate very high on the hierarchy of human needs. So I would say that technological progress has definitely slowed in the last several decades, and I think we're unlikely to see a repeat of the pace and scale of advancement that we saw between, say, 1800 and 1950. I can't rule it out, of course. There might be some huge breakthrough in our understanding of physical reality that leads to a huge new era of progress, but it would be foolish to bank on it. So I would say that even if capitalism is the best system for technological development, it quite clearly is a mistake to accredit it with magical powers. It can't change physical reality. So I would give the bulk of credit for our technological age to science. Anyway, there's tons more that can be said about technological progress and how it relates to the economy, but moving on. Beyond labor exploitation, capitalism has some other problems. For one thing, the system has some instability. It does tend towards crisis. There's the so-called business cycles, the cycles of boom and bust. Another pretty obvious problem is that the system relies upon market expansion, which of course can't go on forever. At some point, globalization will be done. Presumably after China and India, we're going to move on to Africa as the periphery to exploit, but then after that, we're done. There's no more periphery. We live in a finite world. There are only so many markets. Also, of course, there are finite resources, which is another reason things can't grow forever. At some point, we run out of fossil fuels, or in burning the fossil fuels, we wreck the planet. The point is that in one way or another, capitalism is going to run into limits. But it's a system that presumes perpetual growth, that there are no limits. So it's an open question of what's going to happen at that point. Probably nothing good. One more problem with capitalism is what Marxists call alienation, which is the general sense of feeling that you are not part of something to which you should belong. You don't feel like you're part of a community, you feel disconnected from society, you feel ostracized. In Marx's context, he talks about how people are alienated from their labor. They have to go to these jobs, but they don't feel like they're in control over the products of their labor and how their work is done. So beyond the material deprivations of being exploited, capitalism makes people feel bad. Alienation is its own huge topic, of which I can barely scratch the surface here, so I'll just give you a few quick bullet points. So one way in which we're alienated under capitalism is that our time is monopolized, and this actually is increasingly true for both for the labor class and for the capitalist class, because the capitalists are not the idle rich they used to be. Everything is sped up, our time is regimented, and that leaves no space for anything outside of our economic roles. Furthermore, people are divided by their class and their jobs and their status, creating social distance wherein, say, people only marry people with similar jobs and education. It can also be argued that we've created a transactional society, a society where people are only valued for what they can do for other people, and this can negatively affect people both in the labor class and among the wealthy. Wealthy people sometimes complain that they can't have real relationships because everyone just wants to use them for their money. Alienation is also created by geographical displacement. If, for the sake of a job or career, you have to move across the country, then you're having to move away from friends and family, so you're breaking all these social ties and having to create new ones. But it's very difficult to make new bonds because everyone's time is monopolized. And last thing to say about alienation is that a lot of modern Marxists will complain about manufactured desires, about consumerism, that is, the consumption of things you don't really need and don't even really want. For example, in a highly competitive society, it's easy to inculcate desires for status signals, and the pressures of competition create demands for relief, a vague sense that by acquiring new things, your life is progressing, that things are getting better, even if the pleasure derived from that consumption is fleeting. Again, Marx describes two basic problems of capitalism. It has a tendency to create material deprivation for the masses, and it has a tendency to alienate everyone, to make everyone unhappy. Why is this system created and maintained? Well, because there's an elite class that benefits. To Marxists, the broad arc of history looks like this. In the ancient world, we had slavery. In the medieval and Renaissance period, we had feudalism. And now in the modern era, we have capitalism. And each one of these systems maintains an elite. Slavery has masters, feudalism has aristocrats, and capitalism has the capitalists. So, contrary to the story usually told in the American popular culture and in schools, when we threw off aristocracy in the American Revolution, we were actually just trading an old set of elites for a new set, the capitalists. And in fact, as I'll get into later, most socialists would say that at no point in human history has there ever been a major society that wasn't ruled by an elite, including the supposedly communist countries. And this rule by the elite, in fact, is the core problem of human history. Advocates of capitalism, on the other hand, what they usually say is under liberal democracy and a capitalist system, there is no elite. And this, of course, is true in a formal sense. There's no membership card for being a capitalist, and nothing is legally barring anyone from acting as a capitalist. But of course, a person needs wealth to do so. And to the extent a class division is acknowledged, the counter-argument is that members of the labor class can in some cases actually ascend into the elite class. But I think the important question is how frequently that actually happens. If on a daily basis we were all to swap places, today I'm a laborer, tomorrow I'm a capitalist, and the day after I'm a laborer again, if we were swapping roles that quickly, we wouldn't really have then distinct classes. There would just be roles we swap in and out of. But of course that doesn't happen in practice, and the number one predictor of your class status is your parents' class status. More importantly, if everyone in the labor class did somehow pull themselves up by the bootstraps, well, they can't all do so together. Systematically, if everyone becomes a capitalist, there would be no labor class, and so the whole system couldn't work. Just like we can't all be doctors and engineers, we can't all be entrepreneurs, we can't all be investors. That just wouldn't work. Regardless whether you buy the Marxist story of class division under capitalism, you can at least agree that not everyone is rich. And in fact, arguably the biggest story of capitalism since the 1970s has been that in the developed world, the middle class has declined, taking on debt while wages remain stagnant. Perhaps their material condition has not worsened all that much, and in fact in some ways has improved, but the middle classes of the Western world, particularly the United States, are definitely much less economically secure. They're in debt, they have to work more, and their jobs are more precarious. And this decline of the middle class is probably why most everyone in the Western world these days is unhappy and scared about the future, both on the left and right and in the center. Marxists have a quite clear story about why this is happening. There's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, there's a tendency for the material condition of the labor class to get worse and worse, and Marxists would say that the golden era of the United States, the post-war period, that was the historical anomaly, and now in this neoliberal era, as they call it, we're back in the normal capitalist story where everyone is trying to extract as much as possible out of everyone else. But what is the pro-capitalist account of what's been happening? Well, on the right, the economic libertarians, they're going to tell you that we're not capitalist enough, and that's why everything is going bad. Another common attitude on the right is that, well, life is a competition, so even if we're at the natural limits of the supply of good jobs and there's nothing we can do to reduce the number of poor people, well, that's okay because it's just up to everyone to fight it out, to jockey for position, and if you win, you're a winner, if you lose, you're a loser. However, I think the story more commonly told, the story told by America's centrist upholders of the status quo, the first thing they'll say is that there's no alternative. Whatever ills capitalism is suffering, any alternative is going to be worse, so we're stuck with it. Another thing they'll commonly say, though I think this was more common back in the 90s, is that, well, you just need to be patient. If we just wait, economic development will deliver more and better jobs in time, and we just need to stay the course. A third thing they'll say is that, well, if we don't have enough good jobs, that's compensated by the cheaper and better goods and services that have been created by economic development, so it's worth the trade-off. But I think what the centrists say most frequently and loudest is that the problem is with the workers themselves. Workers need to be entrepreneurial, they need to get creative and create their own jobs, they need to find some niche that maybe doesn't exist yet, they need to be dynamic. And they'll say that any worker who doesn't have a good job, well, it's really their own fault because they're not educated enough, they don't have work discipline, they should have done better in school, and the only systemic fix that we might consider is to reform the education system. We need more discipline in the education system, we need to funnel people into training, etc. It's all about education. That is the main centrist position. Whatever problems might exist, we just need to create more opportunity. Marxists say, no, there is no education fix for our problems. Our problems are systemic, and their roots lie outside of education. Finally, we get to our second definition of socialism, which is an economy that is democratically controlled. If you're an anarchist, if you're that brand of socialist, what you have in mind is social control over the economy, not necessarily state control, because you don't want there really to be any state. So when the demos, when the people, when they control the economy, they're doing so informally and cooperatively, not through state mechanisms. If you're not an anarchist, though, if you accept that there is a role for the state, but you're still a socialist, then this does imply some kind of state control of the economy. If, hopefully, you have a democratic state, then state control of the economy would be democratic control. But I don't think state control necessarily implies centralized control. If you say centralized, it's implied that the state is reaching in and making a bunch of detailed decisions, that the state controls all industry and everyone is employed by the state. That's not necessarily what state control has to look like. Just because I control something, because I have the prerogative to decide things, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm constantly micromanaging. So I would say you can have a socialist state that uses big levers: fiscal policy, tax policy, and regulation of the markets, particularly finance and the labor market. In such a state, you might nationalize certain industries, particularly industries that lend themselves to natural monopolies and other dysfunctions like utilities and healthcare, etc. But this would not be a state that bars private enterprise or private property. Basically, what I'm describing is what's called market socialism. A lot of socialists will deride market socialism as being an oxymoron, but I don't think that's the case. In fact, market socialism describes the Nordic countries, which I think most socialists agree are the closest thing we've had to real socialist countries. An obvious counter-argument, though, is that all the mechanisms I laid out, tax policy, labor regulation, a few nationalized industries, well, that all arguably already applies to the United States, which socialists certainly don't think of as socialist. I would say, though, what matters here is degree. It's not enough to have policies in these areas. It matters how far these policies go, particularly labor regulation. The core problem described by Marx is that labor is at a systematic disadvantage respective to capital. If you had a properly democratic state, which I don't think the United States does, which is a whole huge topic unto itself, but assuming you do, and assuming your society understands that it is both a practical imperative and a moral imperative for the government to intervene in the economy rather than letting the operations of the market be, then I believe you can institute aggressive labor regulations that give the labor class real power. And in fact, if you go far enough, if you give labor enough advantages, you can greatly compress the divide between the labor and capitalist classes to the point where the division effectively disappears. You'd still have people who act as entrepreneurs, investors, managers, but not only would their income and wealth be much more in line with everyone else's, but also they wouldn't have outsized power, both in the economy and the state. Once you get rid of the class division, then everyone is basically a worker, and in this democratic state, everyone, the workers, would control the means of production. They'd control the economy. Again, in today's capitalist countries like the United States, we have some of these things like taxes and regulation, but they're very weak forms of these things. People on the right will point at these things and decry how socialist the United States is, but in Marxist terms, what are the social relations of production? What is the relationship between employers and employees? Who is holding the power? Which side has an advantage in the labor market, and what implications does that have for the daily lives of the people in that country? So, this leads into our third possible definition of socialism. Is socialism simply just income and wealth redistribution? Well, a lot of people on the right would like to say that it is because they hate redistribution. They think it's immoral and call it theft. Socialists think that income and wealth redistribution might be a valid mechanism employed in a truly socialist society, but most socialists would say that by itself, redistribution is generally inadequate. I suppose in theory you could have an extreme version of redistribution where, after the fact of market outcomes, we redistribute enough to change the power balance between labor and capital, perhaps even so much as to effectively dissolve the class distinction. But it's a roundabout way of achieving that goal, and it also has a lot of practical problems, particularly political problems. Even if a truly socialist society based on redistribution could be stable, I don't see how you would get there. Even if the United States were properly democratic, I don't see how you would sell people on using massive redistribution, because again, your aim is to rebalance power and establish a stable general prosperity, to change the quality of everyone's lives both in and outside of their work. And that's expecting a lot just from redistribution. You can make the argument that it would work, it's a logical argument, but I think it would be hard to sell. It also has a bunch of other problems in the context of the international capitalist system, like capital flight and capital strikes. So, in the end, I think socialists should stick up for the morality of redistribution while still being very clear about its limitations. Lastly, we come to what I think is the weakest definition of socialism, and that is to define it as collectivism, which is obviously not a great definition because we have to define collectivism itself, which is itself a nebulous term with competing definitions. For one thing, the term is sometimes used out of a political context in sociology to talk about societies that are very family or extended family oriented or even tribalist. So in sociology speak, the collective is something quite different than a nation-state group. There might be some political relevance to this conception of collectivism, but I don't think it's really what either side in the socialism debate is really talking about. Now, on the pro-socialist side, some have embraced the term, though I'd say the term has fallen out of favor among socialists to the point where the term is much more frequently used by opponents. Opponents like to define socialism as collectivism because the term has a negative connotation of individuals subsuming their identity and their will to the group. It has connotations of conformity and glorification of the national group at the expense of individuals. Socialists, though, to the extent they do embrace the term, they're talking about something very different. They're, yes, talking about individuals sacrificing the group, but with the corollary that the group is sacrificing for the individual. And in fact, the only reason individuals are meant to sacrifice to the group is because groups are made out of individuals, of course, so any group action has to be carried out by its individuals. And so in a sense, yes, individuals are subservient to the group, but the whole purpose is to support individuals within the group. The idea is, if we live in a society, then we have communal obligations. Sometimes opponents of socialism do acknowledge this very different sense of collectivism, but they argue that the good kind of collectivism, a system of communal obligation and mutual aid, this good collectivism, they say, will inevitably slide into the bad kind of collectivism, the kind that most people in American society finds unappealing, wherein individuals subsume their will and identity to the group. Now, whether the good kind inevitably leads to the bad kind is a whole big argument outside of our scope here. I'm just really trying to define socialism, but consider briefly just how opposed these two kinds of collectivism are. In one kind, individuals are expendable, and in the other kind, they're not. In the good kind, if an individual gets sick and needs assistance, society is obligated to provide that assistance, but in the bad kind, the person is just dead weight. They can't contribute to the group, and the group is all that matters, so the person should just be tossed aside. And I certainly wouldn't try to label capitalism as collectivist, but it certainly is a system in which individuals are expendable. If you can't pull your own weight, well, then no one's going to be around to help you, certainly not in any systemic way. Maybe you get lucky and a private charity takes up your case, but there's nothing guaranteed. And if you don't have the right social connections, if you aren't in the right place at the right time, well, then the only help you're going to get is the help you give yourself. That's capitalism. Individuals are expendable. There is no group. So to review, looking again at the four definitions, here's how I think they stack up. Defining socialism as a classist society, I think best articulates the goal of socialism. The problem we're trying to overcome is that we have this elite ruling class. A democratic economy, in Marxist terms, the workers controlling the means of production, that is the primary solution to the problem. Income and wealth redistribution, meanwhile, is just a possible part of the solution. And collectivism, you could say, is in accord with socialism, at least in one sense, but not in another. Having defined socialism, now really quick, well, what is communism? There's a lot of confusion about this term. The first thing to understand is that you can't really nail down one definition because communism means very different things depending upon which authority you ask. You get one definition if you read Marx and Engels, but you get different definitions if you look at how communism was ostensibly implemented, first by Lenin in the Soviet Union, and then by Stalin, and then by Mao in China, and then in North Korea, and Cuba, and Vietnam. Each one of these communist parties and communist leaders defined communism in their own way. And of course, there's a gap between the rhetoric they espoused and what they actually implemented. But first, going back to Marx and Engels, well, they themselves didn't coin the term. It was used by prior socialists, and Marx and Engels simply adopted it. But in their conception, communism is the end state of social evolution. And what they called socialism was to be merely a transition period between capitalism and communism. And the idea was that ultimately, in this end state, we'll have not just a classist society, but also a society which is moneyless and stateless. The countries which in the United States we called communist, they themselves identified as socialist states, but they were led by communist parties with the idea that the parties were leading the evolutionary process from socialism to the proper end state of communism. In the transitory state of socialism, they explicitly retained money and the state, of course, but the communist countries did present themselves as being classless. Most socialists today, however, understand that no, these states clearly were ruled by an elite class. In the case of the Russian Revolution, yes, they were throwing off a corrupt ruling elite, but clearly they instituted a new ruling elite, the members of the Communist Party. So I would say, on the most basic requirement of socialism, these so-called communist countries were complete failures. It's a large and interesting question of why they all failed in the same way, why these revolutions ostensibly against an old elite for the sake of the masses, why they were corrupted very early on in their inceptions. I would say it's mainly a factor of violent revolutions necessarily being led by an elite, and the revolution only ending when a new elite emerges to establish a new order. Another basic problem with these revolutions is that there really wasn't a clearly established vision of what a socialist state would look like, because the primary authorities, Marx and Engels, actually gave a very vague and brief prescription. If you look at Marx's writings, almost all of it is a critique of capitalism, and while there's implications in there of what a post-capitalist society should look like, he really does not get explicit at all. He does not go into detail. This has been a general theme of socialist history. A dominant vein within socialism has been these anarchist tendencies, these anti-statist tendencies, and so the revolutionaries have been very hesitant to get nailed down on what exactly this new society would look like and how the new order would function. There's a strong emphasis on bottom-up power structures somehow emerging, and so we can't possibly know what their form will look like. And this is a problem that still affects socialism today. Socialists as a group can agree on not liking the status quo, and they can critique what arises from the established rules, but they're often very hesitant to propose an alternative system in any detail. And in fact, a lot of them still have this anarchist way of thinking that is very distrustful of rules, and so is unwilling to paint a plausible picture of what socialist utopia would look like and how it would function.